Seeing that the crux of my channel is pretty much entirely based around gender dysphoria and trying to meet people where they're at and solve the problem from a Catholic perspective, I figured I would dedicate this video to discussing what actually is the gender problem and why should Catholics be thinking about it harder. First and foremost, the gender problem is a much more complicated issue than just there are men who want to be women, or there are women who want to be men, or that they think they're women, or that they think they're men. That is a drastic oversimplification. First and foremost, it forgets about the fact of pain and human suffering. We as Catholics are supposed to meet people where they're at in their suffering. That is a crucial part to being able to love someone, is to understand the pain that they're going through, that we can meet them where they're at. The next step above that, aside from just the bare bones human problem, the next step above that is the rational problem. Because this issue, the pain that these people are feeling, brings up a lot of complicated issues that philosophers can't agree on. And that's significant because philosophy is the primary field of study that addresses this kind of issue. You can't really determine with science what makes someone a man or a woman. I mean that in the sense that you can't really define those categories with the scientific method. What you can do is point out biological qualities. Science will determine that, but it doesn't tell us the metaphysical qualities of manness or womanness. Going a step farther out, we start looking at a bigger problem than simply the problem with gender theory, and recognizing that there is a growing distinction in secular society from the way that Christians, and Catholics in particular, categorize the world and the way that the secular society categorizes the world. What I mean by that is there is primarily the problem of existentialism, which is a ideological category in philosophy that is fairly recent, would fall into the category of 19th and 20th century philosophy, that basically says that humans are the prime determiners of what a category is, what makes a thing what it is. This statue is a statue. Existentialism says that it is a statue because I, and likely yourself, being a thinking, understanding creature, understand it to be a statue. That's what makes it a statue. The big push in this school of thought within philosophy, however, is not about determining whether a statue is a thing or not. And the big transition it causes in society is with what makes a human a human. See, if you come forward and you deny God, deny the existence of God, or even angels, or anything, any kind of intellect greater in a hierarchy of being than humans, then humans can't have any purpose or definite quality. That's because if there's no intellect greater than a human, then there is no intellect greater than a human's to determine what a human is. So it's up to the human intellect to determine what it is. Combining this philosophical concept with a bit of a humanitarian ideology, you get this push to say that a person should be free to define who and what they are. That is a major part that the gender problem stems from. This idea that a person ought to be able to determine who and what they are, not just in a manner of how they move forward in their own personality, what job they want, or how they want to dress, but even more so that the way they define themselves, the way we define ourselves, becomes a fact of our nature. So, we have, at the base of it all, the problem of human suffering and pain. The next step above that is trying to understand what makes a person a man and what makes a person a woman, And woven into all of that is a social issue, a social intellectual issue, where it's starting to separate Catholics and non-Catholics on a more fundamental basis of how we interpret the world. Those are kind of some of the separate qualities that build together in this issue. So what do we need to know about all of these things as Catholics? Well, first, start with that bigger level. The general transition and separation between modes of reasoning, the way society is thinking and the way Catholics think. First of all, it's important just to understand that divide. The fact that we as Catholics are thinking about the world in a fundamentally different way than how most people are thinking about the world. Like I was saying before, a big part of that has to do with what we determine, or how we determine what a thing is. And I know that seems really simple. Why should it matter how we decide that this is paper or that that's a statue? The reason it matters doesn't have to do with the statue or the paper or anything else that we can put in that box. The reason that matters is that in order to connect with somebody, in order to understand each other and communicate and relate, we need to have an established language. I use language as a metaphor in this way. If I'm having a discussion with somebody and I'm continually talking about a statue, and I continue to use the word statue over and over again, referring to something like that is like this, then the other person has to also define statue as something like this in order to understand what I'm saying. Because if they defined statue as something like this, then every time I said statue meaning this, they would think this. And these are not alike. That's why it's important for us to understand that society as a whole is leaning more and more to a way of conceptualizing reality that is vastly different than the way that we as Catholics conceptualize reality. So, just at a level of communication and interrelation, that's important. And as we've been told, we are to live in the world and not of it. But to live in the world, we must understand how the world at a time behaves. So that's the big picture. That's the overarching thing. Why we should understand that there's a push away from the traditional way that Catholics conceptualize the world. The next problem is how do we categorize the human experience in relation to gender? There's a push and an often distinction between sex and gender, and that's deeply connected with this distinction in how the world is categorized. I don't think it's an entirely bogus thing to say that they're two totally separate things, but we need to understand that it is being pushed and people are understanding that there is a difference between sex and gender. One of the difficulties that comes with this level of the problem is that while most people tend to agree that there's a difference between sex and gender, there is not much agreement on what gender is, really. Most people will accept a binary sexual human nature. That is to say that there are males and females, and that those qualities are strict biological categories in relation to human reproduction. Gender seems to be a slightly different topic when we're talking about human behavior and personality. And this is where defining what a man is and what a woman is becomes particularly difficult. Because if we're drawing a distinction between the physical, biological qualities of a person that relate to sexual reproduction and more personality-based qualities, we're essentially defining a very ambiguous category. Now, ambiguous categories aren't without their place. There's a lot of ambiguous categories. But it does cause difficulty when we bring up communication and discussion on the topic. Catholics often tend to fall into the camp of sex and gender are the same thing. So, if Catholics are talking to somebody who defines it differently, and we keep talking about sex and gender, and using these terms interchangeably, where somebody else isn't using them interchangeably, it's going to halt conversation and likely lead to arguments. I personally have a video on what I think gender is, and how I personally defined it is a quality of human experience and human relationship that determines how we interrelate with one another, and it's based off of our sex. So I do think it is different, but it's still based on biological sex. That's not the typical understanding. That's my attempt to assign a reasonable definition to this category. Now, those are the two big ones out of the way. The biggest category relating to existentialism and the change in the way people conceptualize the world. What men and women are as a whole and how it's a difficult category to define. And then our biggest problem, and this is the part that most needs to be understood by Catholics. The pain. It is easy to say, oh, he wishes he was a woman, or he thinks he's a woman, or she thinks she's a man, or wishes she was a man. It's easy to say those things. But the problem isn't just in that someone might desire those things. And I speak of this from personal experience. It's not just that I find the female form desirable, that I may wish or have a desire to have had the female form. That is more a final step on a road of pain. The road of pain that is gender dysphoria doesn't start there. It starts with a recognition of the self. It starts with identifying what qualities you have personally, right? So if I look at my body, in some ways my mind, I see the qualities attributed with the male sexuality. I am biologically male. Not only that, but I look at the qualities society attributes with that gender. And I'm using gender in the term I defined previously, that it is a mode of being and relationship based on one's biological sex. So what I'm saying is that if we look at the stereotypes, the typical ways that men interact with other people, that biological males interact with other people and have relationships with other people, which is an intricate and complicated dynamic. Like if you look at any social situations, any relationships, like everybody understands the complexity of social interactions. If you look at the way men behave in social interactions and in society, you can start to identify certain characteristics and qualities of men. Gender dysphoria starts not just with the recognition of physical qualities, but also those qualities in gender. At some point in that list, you start to see things that don't add up. Many men, especially just when interacting together, tend to get really energetic, excitable, and in some ways foolish. And I don't mean foolish in a sense of like an idiot or doing dumb things, but foolish in a sense of a kind of playfulness. And those are qualities that I don't really have. But when you're young and you're being put into a box that assumes you're going to behave that way, it becomes uncomfortable. As those things build up, as you start to recognize typical qualities of a category you're supposed to fit into that you don't have, and to a greater extent may not even like, but to be put constantly by other people into that box, it becomes uncomfortable and painful. Many people have pointed out the exceptionally high death rate, suicide rate, amongst trans individuals and other individuals with gender dysphoria. Because before it can be simplified as men who think they're women, or women who think they're men, before you get to that stage, before you get to someone who wishes they were something other than what they are, physically speaking, or what they're being told they are, you have pain. This is one of the most crucial things that we as Catholics must understand. This is why we can't simplify the topic. This is why we can't brush it off or assume that people are simply pushing back and trying to claim pride of the world. That's a very common argument in Catholic spheres, is that people with gender dysphoria, especially trans people, that they're just being exceptionally prideful and trying to claim control over the world. Yeah, maybe that is how it can be categorized in a clinical sense. But the most important thing for us to understand as Catholics is that it's not just somebody who is trying to be exceptionally prideful in trying to assert their own will upon the earth. Because what it first comes from is pain. We as Catholics are called to meet someone in their pain. We're called to love people. And one of the first steps in loving people is meeting them in their pain. Thomas Aquinas traditionally defines love as to will the good of another. And when this issue, this gender issue, comes up, it is very common for us to think of willing the good of the other as they need to be told they're wrong. People need to be corrected for thinking there's something that they're not. The unfortunate thing is that perspective is from the perspective of somebody who thinks that they're men who think they're women. Not from the perspective of somebody who thinks that is a broken individual. That is somebody who has suffered. And I think that's what really a lot of this comes down to. I think that's what the biggest thing that, if you take anything from this video, that you need to understand is the first and foremost part of gender dysphoria is pain. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this video. It was a kind of different video for me today, but I think it is one that I hope will resonate with a lot of people, and I hope a lot of people will understand, especially that last bit. So, if you have any questions, if you have any thoughts of your own, leave them in a comment below. If you've got a good question or a good objection, I'll respond to it. If you like the video, give me a like, and don't forget to subscribe so that I will show up in your recommendations if you want to see more of my videos. Anyway, guys, thank you so much. I'll see you in the next one.